For most of human history, the idea of a meal looked nothing like what you'd recognize today. No grocery stores, no cultivated fields, no recipes passed down through generations, just people moving across a landscape, eating whatever the land offered and whatever they were clever enough to catch. But here's the thing most people get wrong about ancient human diets. They assume it was simple. One kind of food, one strategy, repeated endlessly for millions of years. That picture is wrong, and the more researchers dig into the fossil record, the chemical residues in ancient bones, and the sites where early humans actually lived, the more complicated and genuinely fascinating that picture becomes. Let's start at the very beginning, which means going back well before Homo sapiens ever existed. Around 3.5 million years ago, our ancestors were Australopithecines. They walked upright, but their brains were small, roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, and their diet reflected that. Isotope analysis from fossilized teeth tells us they were eating a mix of C3 plants, things like leaves, fruits, and woodland vegetation, and C4 plants, which included grasses and sedges growing in more open environments. They weren't locked into one food source. Even that far back, the ability to switch between options was already part of the picture. Then something shifted. Around 2.5 million years ago, a major climate change dried out large portions of Africa. Forests shrank, grasslands expanded, and the food supply reorganized itself entirely. This is right around the time the first stone tools appear in the archaeological record, and it's not a coincidence. Early Homo, the genus that eventually led to us, began using sharp stone flakes to butcher animal carcasses. Not to hunt, at least not yet. These were scavengers. They were following predators, waiting, and then moving in to strip meat and crack bones before the competition arrived. The marrow inside those bones was incredibly calorie-dense, and cracking them open was a skill most other animals couldn't manage. That's a real advantage when you're competing for food in an open savanna. So what did that diet actually look like? Think a lot of tubers, roots, and underground storage organs, things that other animals struggled to access but that early humans could dig up with basic tools. Add in whatever fruit was available seasonally, seeds, nuts, insect larvae, bird eggs, and occasional meat when they could get it. Researchers like Richard Wrangham have argued that cooking, even in its earliest and most basic form, was transformative. Cooked food is easier to chew, easier to digest, and delivers more usable calories per bite. Wrangham's hypothesis is that cooking essentially subsidized the growth of larger brains, because a bigger brain needs more fuel, and cooked food delivers that fuel more efficiently. The debate over exactly when controlled fire use began is still active, but evidence from sites in South Africa suggests it may go back nearly 1 million years. Meat eating expanded significantly with Homo erectus, that species that survived for close to 2 million years and spread across large parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Their bodies were built for endurance, running, long legs, efficient frames, and researchers think they may have used persistence hunting, running prey animals to exhaustion over long distances in the midday heat. Modern humans in a few hunter-gatherer societies still do this. It works because humans sweat and regulate body temperature far better than most quadrupeds, which overheat before we do. The caloric payoff from a large animal kill was enormous compared to foraging, which gave groups that could pull it off a substantial edge. But here's what gets interesting when you zoom into the regional variation. Ancient human diets weren't uniform across the world. They were deeply local. Coastal populations were eating shellfish and marine mammals tens of thousands of years before it became fashionable to credit seafood as a brain food. Sites along the South African coast at places like Pinnacle Point show evidence of shellfish consumption going back around 165,000 years. The omega-3 fatty acids available from coastal diets may have played a real role in cognitive development, though pinning causation on any single food source gets complicated fast. Inland populations and colder climates skewed heavily toward animal protein and fat. Neanderthals, for example, left a strong chemical signature in their bones. Isotope studies show their diet was dominated by large herbivores, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, bison, the kind of animals that could sustain a group for days on a single kill. They weren't ignoring plant foods entirely. Dental calculus pulled from Neanderthal teeth has revealed traces of cooked starchy plants, mushrooms, and even medicinal plants in some cases. But the protein contribution from meat was enormous, comparable to what you'd see in top predators like wolves or hyenas. These were not casual hunters picking off easy targets. They were going after the biggest and most dangerous animals in their environment, which required coordination, planning, and real skill. Now let's talk about plant foods, because they've been underestimated in this story for a long time. For most of the 20th century, the public image of prehistoric humans was almost entirely focused on hunting, big game, stone spears, dramatic kills. But that image was partly a product of who was doing the research and what they were looking for. Gathering, which was predominantly done by women in most documented hunter-gatherer societies, contributed the majority of calories in many environments. Not a small fraction, the majority. In tropical and subtropical regions where plant foods were available year-round, Gathered foods could account for 60 to 80% of total caloric intake. The hunting story is real, but it's only part of the story. Some of the most surprising evidence about ancient plant consumption comes from dental calculus, that hardened plaque that builds up on teeth. It acts like a time capsule. Researchers have found starch granules from wild grains, legumes, and root vegetables preserved in the teeth of humans going back over 100,000 years. At a site in Mozambique called Nglalu, stone grinding tools dating to around 105,000 years ago showed traces of wild sorghum. These weren't farmers. They were gathering wild grasses and processing them, which pushes cereal consumption back far earlier than agriculture and raises questions about how long humans had been living on grain before they decided to start growing it deliberately. Which brings up something worth sitting with for a moment. Why did humans start farming? It seems obvious in hindsight, but domesticated agriculture only emerged around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And for the vast majority of human existence before that, people were managing just fine without it. Hunter-gatherers often worked fewer hours per day to feed themselves than early farmers did. The skeletal evidence from populations that transitioned to agriculture shows a decline in average health, smaller stature, more tooth decay, more signs of nutritional stress. Farming wasn't an obvious upgrade, it was a trade-off. More reliable calories in exchange for harder work, narrower diets, and much higher population density, which brought its own problems. The leading theories involve a combination of population pressure and climate stability. Around 12,000 years ago, after the end of the last ice age, the climate in parts of the Middle East became warmer and more consistent. Wild grasses became more abundant, human populations grew, and at some point groups began actively tending patches of wild grains, returning to the same areas, clearing competitors, and eventually selecting for plants that held their seeds better, which is a trait that's actually disadvantageous for wild grasses but very convenient for people trying to harvest them. Domestication wasn't a single decision. It was a slow drift happening over centuries until one day a population was genuinely dependent on a handful of cultivated species rather than dozens of wild ones. The consequences for diet were significant. A forager moving across a varied landscape might eat 100 or more different plant species over the course of a year, along with a rotating cast of animal proteins. An early farming community might depend on 2 or 3 staple crops, supplemented by whatever hunting and gathering they still practiced. Diversity collapsed. The variety of nutrients coming in through food narrowed dramatically. That's reflected in the bones. Isotope signatures from early agricultural populations are far more uniform than those from foragers in the same region. The same foods, eaten over and over, season after season. Across different parts of the world, the staple crops that anchored early diets were almost entirely local. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, rice and millet in China, sorghum and pearl millet across sub-Saharan Africa, maize, squash, and beans in Mesoamerica. Each of these transitions happened independently, in separate parts of the world, within a few thousand years of each other, which is a strange convergence that researchers are still trying to fully explain. There's something about that particular window in time after the Ice Age, when conditions across multiple continents lined up in a way that made settled agriculture a viable strategy. One thing that often surprises people is how much ancient diets varied by season. For a forager in a temperate environment, the summer and autumn months might be a period of genuine abundance. Berries, nuts, game animals putting on fat before winter, fish running upstream. But late winter and early spring were genuinely lean times, before new plant growth arrived and after the previous year's stored food ran out. Skeletal evidence suggests that many ancient populations experienced cyclical nutritional stress, periods of lower calorie intake that left marks on bones and teeth. Enamel hypoplasia, small horizontal lines on teeth that form when growth briefly stops, are found frequently in prehistoric remains and indicate that food shortages weren't exceptional events. They were a recurring part of life. Fat was arguably more valuable than protein for much of prehistory, because fat delivers more than twice the calories per gram of either protein or carbohydrates. Groups that could access fat-rich foods, fatty fish, bone marrow, animal organs, nuts, and seeds with high fat content had a real survival advantage. There's evidence that early humans specifically targeted fat-bearing parts of carcasses rather than lean muscle meat, which is the opposite of how most modern cultures think about animal food. Organ meats were prized. Brains, liver, kidney. These delivered fat, fat-soluble vitamins, and micronutrients that lean muscle couldn't match. A fully intact mammoth carcass would have represented something like a small fortune in calories and nutrients for a group encountering it in the depths of a northern winter. The picture that emerges from all of this research is one of remarkable flexibility. Ancient humans didn't have a diet. They had diets, plural, shaped by geography, season, climate, and the particular skills and knowledge of the group they belonged to. What made us successful as a species wasn't attachment to any single food source, but the capacity to read a new environment and figure out what it offered. Whether that was shellfish on a South African coast, frozen megafauna in Siberia, wild grains in the Levant, or river fish in Southeast Asia, the strategy was always the same. Find what's available, figure out how to get more of it, and keep moving when it runs out.